this question quite a bit from my background and experience, local, state, federal, now tribal government. What do you think the number one threat facing our government or our country or our nation, world is? And most people think it's going to be an active assailant, a terrorist attack in a traditional sense.
And they make the news, right? Let's face it.
All day long, all day long, Jay. You know, and so it's cyber. Cyber is the high probability, high impact items that we need to plan for and be prepared to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. Being in the cybersecurity space, I see the impact that the ransomware events have. And we were chatting about this a little bit before, right? Like, if people want to treat it like, well, my business doesn't have data that an attacker might care about, or, you know, my business is small, so I'm not going to be a target. And most of these are indiscriminate. You know, this is simply organized crime, mostly. I don't want to say, you know, totally, but most of what we see, if we've done 100 incident response jobs in the last couple of years, 99 have simply been because somebody has somewhat poorly implemented security or most likely fallen for a phishing attack and is a victim of ransomware. It's not because they've got, you know, top secret plans for the new submarine necessarily. We're not seeing that. It affects everybody every day.
Is it sort of like they had the unlocked door, right? You said organized, and part of me goes to organized and automated, just, you know, knowing even, you know, here what we, you know, often block is just people pressure testing, right? Trying to see if there's an easy way in, right?
Yeah.
So is that part of it too? Is just, you know, even just having good hygiene, good fundamentals.
So I do have a comment here. 'Cause as soon as what you said was, you know, is there anything that anybody said that you felt you wanted to react to?
Yeah.
And
name names.
And honestly, I think it might have been Yelly who actually had some really great conversations prior to the talk with, but I think he said cybersecurity is complicated, right? You have to implement fundamental controls, but it's not easy. And on the one hand, I kind of agree with that. On the other hand, I really want to push back a bit on that idea, because what I think it does is discourage small businesses from trying to do the right things, because they feel like it is hard. I might not have the security practitioner on staff, or I might not have the budget to implement all of this stuff. And frankly, it is blocking and tackling. You know, did you actually apply patches to your servers and your desktop computers and your workstations? Did you scan for and fix vulnerabilities? And frankly, all these vulnerabilities are published by, you know, Adobe and Microsoft and Apple, right? Like, they're out in the wild. I said it was organized crime. It's all about return on investment. They're typically not looking to do sophisticated and creative attacks. They're doing what you described, which is, let's do a drive-by. All right, they left their window open.
Right.
I'm going to attack them. Do the basics.
Right. And let me build off of that. Agree with you 100%. Everything's becoming smarter, right? Our washing machines, our dryers, our cars, our phones, everything's becoming smarter. And so that's wonderful. And the goal here is to enhance and improve the quality of life, right, through the improvement of technology, implementation of the latest and greatest tech. But what that does, as Jay said, it opens up the door, as you mentioned, BJ, too, for other opportunistic things. So Yin-Yo, one of our keynote speakers, you know, she mentioned the humanism, and she talked about how this data is the new power and the currency for today, right? And I think that was a wonderful point. But as it was said, right, maybe Stan Lee, with great power comes great responsibility. And it's so true, because that power can be used for good, or it can be used for bad. And that's part of what we're talking about when it comes to cybersecurity, is how do we protect ourselves from those bad actors.
And so, well, like, if I'm, you talk about, like, kind of the levels of protection that a company can provide itself, right? You have, you know, we talked a little bit about this earlier during the break, but you have organizations that are like Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies, right? And they have huge amounts of data at risk, and they are definitely putting those safeguards in place.
Without a doubt, and they're resourced for it.
And they're resourced for it. And so if you're a company that, you know, is a small to medium-sized business here in Connecticut, and, you know, you now know that attacks are indiscriminate, and, you know, you just have to, you basically have to have like mosquito netting up almost, you know, to keep them from coming in. It's like where do you start at the most basic level to start protecting yourself?
You want to tackle, or you want me to?
I'll start off. To me, and just from experience, low cost, high impact training. Training a staff, the human factor, as Jay was alluding to, any business out there that's concerned about their security, I mean, it's out there in the public realm. There's some basic things you can do: lock down your USB ports, making sure your email's secure. Look, if you get a suspicious email, make sure you have an established protocol in place to handle it. It's things as simple as putting your mouse over the send. And, if it seems to come from the CFO, but you're not sure, that's always a simple way to do it. These are simple, no to low cost things that can be done through basic training for your staff that are available through consultants and frankly on the internet, talking about technology. But then things could become more advanced, and then you bring in companies like Jay and others to maybe do a deeper dive and assessment, penetration testing of your system to really see where some of those vulnerabilities might be. And then you can harden them accordingly.
When it comes to like the training for staff, right? To like, don't click on that email, that kind of thing. Like, is there any studies or data that shows, that a cybersecurity attack, so like, is there any data that shows like the human element contributed more to the effectiveness of that attack versus like the actual tech you have in place?
So I guess I won't be able to, I guess I can't say like, yeah, go to this website and take a look for the data. But as a security company, right, going back to what I said, 99 of the incident response jobs that we did that resulted in ransomware, that resulted in data disclosure, started because somebody succumbed to a phishing email. There are some of that low-hanging fruit thing, but the reality is they're trying to trick people. And somebody asked a question during our panel about, hey, can't the technology fully protect us? And I think the answer was, it does a pretty darn good job, and it weeds out the majority of things that kind of feels, frankly, like background noise. The things that work are spoofing the CFO because, the name and email address is on the corporate website, and sending that email to somebody internally saying, I need you to wire me funds, or I need to approve this transaction, or really personal and directed things work really well. The phishing email that works well is the one that's sent literally by a threat actor, looking like it comes from an individual person to an individual person. It's not the mass stuff. But it's worth it. Again, coming back to, they're trying to make money. It's worth a small investment in having good grammar, doing a little research on LinkedIn to figure out who's in the company, and sending a targeted email. I mean, that's the name of the game for most of this.
So those are all originating from people, those kind of, or is AI actually playing a part in like scaling?
Oh, for sure, from a scale standpoint, no doubt. I think I don't think it substantively changes the attack. I think it does make it quicker, and it's adaptive, so it can do some interesting language.
Does this feel like knowing, like having some of that context and awareness and the actions of mousing over, or, kind of those typical due diligence that you may start to do subconsciously, but then it's almost really having awareness of the sender, right? I think as you were talking about that, we get some internally, right? And one came from our CEO, and immediately it was like, no, the email's too long. It's not from him, right?
Right.
There's too much.
Right.
Emails, because it's like 3 words, like, and it's just like to get a point across, right? And so, some of them are really sophisticated, and they're dupes of an invoice, and it was a resend back, and like an e-clarification.
They're great.
Yeah.
So we were talking before the panel again, and I said, just last week I was driving down the Mass Pike and went through Easy Pass, and within 5 minutes I got a text, and the text was, hey, you need to pay your Easy Pass bill.
I get that all the time.
Yeah, and the fascinating part was it was location specific, right? So it was really targeted. And it took me a double take to realize, like, first of all, right, they're not rescinding my license within 5 minutes. Right? But then you actually do have to read it and recognize it was intentional. It was location based. They knew, they had done stuff to know that I was driving. Like,
sure.
It's
They always
really
have, like, those
fascinating.
squirrely endings to the URLs, though. It's like,
They do. So they're
it's like-
identifiable, sure. But, if I had gotten that same text while just hanging out in my living room chair, right, I would have immediately dismissed it. So it
That
was
is
the
pretty
fact,
sophisticated,
right? Yeah.
Is there a bit more of a disconnect, between good process? It seems like a lot of the conversation and the worry is in and around, investing in digital or technical infrastructure as part of, security protocols. It's a big part of it, but it feels like training is potentially cheaper.
Training is essential. I'm going to keep it real simple. We think of it as like a prop door in the most secure building that you can possibly think of. You can have the most high-tech security possible, cameras, electronics, armed everybody. It takes one prop door to let somebody in. And that's basically an oversimplification, but an easy way to explain. That's what happens when you don't have good training and you don't have good basic hygiene, as you said, Sam, So, but I think another part of this too is society as a whole has become desensitized to breaches.
for sure.
I think that's a huge contributing factor. I mean, I remember, 10 years ago when you got that first letter saying your data's out there, it's like, call the police, call the
Yeah,
National
yeah,
Guard.
yeah.
Now it's like, oh, I'll just put it
Just
in the
another
file with
one,
the other
right?
one, yeah.
Right.
Now it's like
I
my
must-
credit score, like how many,
I got like
how
10
many
Yeah,
dark
so-
websites or whatever is my email on,
So I think there's that part too, that the people are more accustomed, they're now thinking it's a norm. And we got to stop that. Actually, I think we need to spend time as a society as a whole breaking that mindset. No, it's not normal. These are crimes, and we need to do more to raise that level of awareness.
So like that normalization of like, data breaches, hey, they just happen, and it's like a natural disaster. It's like, well, they're just going to happen. We just have to kind of like make sure that we rebuild the house, so to speak, when it does. Like I remember this is like less than a year ago. There was, I think it was like hundreds of millions of social security numbers were leaked, and there was probably a dozen websites where you could go and check to see if your social is part of it, right? And even then, I'm like, I don't want to do that because I don't know if I'm being
site that
like,
I'm going to.
Am I like, is this
Right.
is this all a trick?
Yeah.
And Social Security number to find
Yeah, I
out.
know.
Yeah,
It's
right.
like
Genius.
seems simple enough. Hey, wait a
Give it to
minute. I didn't get that home loan. But like, so what do you see? I guess because like that happened, right? The hundreds of millions, right? Then there was no news, like. Because you don't hear about what are the ramifications or like the consequences, You just know that they're leaked, but you don't hear the stories. I think my social was on there.
I mean, I think everybody's is. There's no part of me that doesn't think that every single person has had their social security number compromised. And so you should have credit monitoring. I honestly think if you haven't been afforded the opportunity to enroll because somebody else had a breach, you should probably enroll in credit monitoring on your own. I think we're naive to think that anybody has one that has not been a victim of some theft somewhere. And that's just my personal opinion.
I agree wholeheartedly. If you were to ask me what is the single most important thing I learned today or I liked hearing from the group today, I'm going to go back to your keynote speaker, Yin Ho. She said, privacy is essential to self-determination. And I think we've lost that, that level of privacy.
That was a good statement.
We're at the 15-minute mark now, halfway done.
Oh, that's good to know.
Well, I think it's,
I don't have my phone. Mel is probably trying to
it
text
feels
me.
like the personal inevitability also is creeping into how people approach their business security, where it's, my socials out there, or, when I face swapped myself on that app 5 years ago,
Right.
they've been using my likeness, for however long.
Yeah.
And I think because we've been desensitized as individuals when it comes to then the professional environment, we're sort of like, it's going to happen, anyway. And what's the use in enforcing the 30-day password reset? What's the use in some of these elements, because someone's going to go and get their personal email on a work computer, or some of these crossover.
So I guess I certainly have a response for it, but so we're talking a little about, we've been focusing on social security numbers. The fact is, everybody here, right, the four of us, everybody in the room, probably has hundreds of usernames and passwords. And I always, in any security awareness talk that I do, I always say, who has a unique password for every website that they go to? And typically one person will raise their hand, and then I quiz them for a second, and maybe the hand goes down. But pretty much nobody knows, right? But I've got what I like is a slide, which is basically showing that if you use one or two or three variations of your password, like most people do, compromise it. LinkedIn, right? If you're using that same credential somewhere else, it's effectively compromised there. And that password scraping concept of, well, I've gotten 100 million usernames and passwords from LinkedIn. Now they're just going to try them at Fidelity and Schwab and
Yeah.
insurance providers. So one of the most important things I tell people is get a password manager. I don't, they're all, the reputable ones are all good. I don't really care. And start today to get new usernames and passwords, unique usernames and passwords for, actually, let me back that up, unique passwords, because the reality is it's probably your email address as your username in most cases. Make it unique. Go through the effort to change it. Use a password manager, because you put yourself at such risk when these are stolen. And you see it all the time. Well, I don't know how they got into my whatever medical site. Well, it's because they stole it from over here, and you use the same password everywhere.
Yeah.
You got it. We have to get, and of course, MFA, right, multi-factor is the other key thing. And I think a lot of people are doing that. But
Yeah.
Jay, I'm going to just make a quick comment on that too. And this is not, we're not giving out any secrets here to bad actors listening into your podcast overseas. It's common knowledge.
Yeah,
but-
they figured it out.
Yeah, they figured it out. But I mean, if you look at some of the breaches that have happened to get to that initial step to gather some information on an individual, the password's 1111 2222 333 1234. Hey, that's my luggage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The same
Great
thing.
scene from Spaceballs.
Yeah, exactly. But literally, that's where it starts, and you would be shocked at how many people actually use those as their passwords for some of the most secure information that they should be holding tight and near and dear to their heart, and that's where the breaches start. Just to kind of transition a little bit, I know our time is in the second half here, but there was a lot of talk about AI. And there wasn't a lot of talk about quantum computing, but I think obviously the two are intricately linked. We're never going to reach that singularity in artificial intelligence if it exists without quantum computing. I think that's the path there. But again, there's a path here, and I'm going to turn to Jay. I'm not a technical expert or BJ, but we're talking a lot about scary stuff. But I think that technology can be game-changing for all businesses to be able to increase their level of security, because it brings a level of experience and expertise that we've never seen before that could become widely available through technology. So I'd just maybe throw that out there.
Yeah, I guess my response is, if it's available to the good guys,
Yeah,
right? It's available to the bad guys. So I don't know. I certainly worry about sort of all of our cryptographic capabilities, right? The second quantum comes now, all the things that we felt were secure because it took, 100,000 years to crack, is probably crackable quickly.
Fraction of a second.
Yeah, so I think there's real risk with that technology coming. The more I do what I do, the more I feel like making sure people understand the risks and can identify them. Like the people are the most important part of what we do on a daily basis. I'm not arguing that you should get away from technical controls, right? They all have value for sure, but they're all circumventable. And we have everybody has a responsibility to understand the world that we live in. And we live in an age now where everybody's walking around with a phone, you're constantly trackable. Right, the Amazon knows what products I want to buy before I do. Like, you need to understand how the technology is being used and be a part of it.
Yeah.
Can't stand in the corner and be frustrated with the fact that these things are happening.
And outside of those that are on the forefront of its development and are true tech unicorns in the space, the majority of, let's be honest, right, the majority of businesses, enterprise, municipalities, governments, that are all on legacy systems that are not even close to being able to keep up with modern technology capabilities, which also is kind of the concerning part of that's who's potentially setting policy, right? That, it's supportive of legacy systems.
Yeah.
But that's where the human factor comes into play even more so, right? Because you almost have to police yourself despite, you have a house with a bunch of broken doors or a bunch of broken locks. So, it's even more so, on the person to be more aware and diligent.
Right.
So I would say that is extremely important. Back to Jay's point, which I, again, started with and totally agree with, the human factors first and foremost for solution finding. But post-COVID, what has happened? We've gone to this remote work environment, right? So what is that based on? Computers. So we've left the office, and now we're all communicating and exchanging and doing business remotely. That increases risk, to your point, Jay. We're all moving towards cloud-based systems, as you said.
Yeah.
Well, we believe cloud-based is more secure than having it on our own server. I'm a little bit old school. I like keeping the money under the mattress so I can see it, but now it's like out there somewhere, you know?
Or
so,
now you have it in 2 places.
or
because-
multiple places,
know,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. You know, so there are increased risks that need to, you know, I think from a common sense and judgment standpoint, need to be really looked at and weighed out.
What about, like, we're talking about the here and now with, like, this is how you protect yourself, these are the steps you take. If you think about it from a generational difference, do you think that, you know, those who are, like, either teenagers now or have grown up in the digital era, like, you know, none of us you
Yeah.
know, grew up with an iPhone or had the capabilities, you know, I look the youngest, obviously, but
But that's just great, though, that's all, right?
but do you think that there's like this generational difference in terms of the knowledge that they have relative to the risks that are posed? Or do you think that everybody's kind of like in the same boat of either not paying attention, not knowing enough, not caring enough?
It is. I'm just going to say this out there.
I'm gonna
sure my
agree with you
daughter's
probably.
watching. Yeah, you know, we both have teenage
Yeah.
children, so you know, I mean, by all definitions, our kids, this generation, they're cyborgs. You know what I mean? They're part human, and they depend on. I mean, they're connected, intricately, intimately connected. to the
Do you think
device.
they even see risk?
No, they don't.
No,
have
and
to.
that's
I- yeah,
that's
I don't
where I
think
was going with it. It's become that standard. That's the norm. You know, how many of this generation, the upcoming and our younger children, do we even see cash? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I send my
right.
daughter money on Apple Pay and Venmo. You know, I can't even remember the last time. Maybe I never have given her $20.
Yeah, I mean, my son gives me his money all the time. He's like, I don't want this at all.
Yeah,
Like,
what
can
is
you-
that?
Right.
Feels odd to me.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I know Jay, you probably have the same experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in a bad spot. They have no regard for their personal privacy, in my opinion. Like they'll post anything. Yeah, I worked in higher ed for a long time, and I saw a lot of foolish things that young people did. They'll post anything. They enable services on their phone that allow them to be tracked by friends. You know, a lot of times it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. I don't think they really have a regard for, you know, I guess in fairness to them, they don't really have a sense of what it's like to live when I did, where, you know, once you got home, you know, nobody could reach you, right?
Yeah.
If the phone was busy, the phone was busy, so there's no getting a hold of you.
So what is the implications then? Like, what does that
Right.
mean?
Call,
for the
collect,
future?
Yeah.
leave the
Yeah,
message
yeah.
when they ask
Yeah.
you what your
Call
name is.
waiting,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
was an innovation when I
Well,
was
have
young.
you ever seen, this is kind of digressing, but there's video of like kids trying to use a dial-up,
Yeah.
you know? It's like, geez.
But what's really scary is, and I forget the exact stat, but the generation, when you look at what they prioritize, just when asked, right, their personal privacy and their online security ranks extremely high, but
Yeah.
then the next bullet point is how connected they are
Right.
in social
Yeah.
and through digital channels. So there isn't even a recognition that those are contrary to each other.
Right.
Right.
Right. And they don't know what.
That's how
what they're
separate
doing.
they are.
So someday these kids are going to be in the position of working at or owning businesses. So like, what does that mean?
I think we need to reinforce. I think the theme here is, regardless of what size business you have, your data is one of your most important assets, and you have to do everything possible, human factor first and foremost, the training, and then you start looking at your technological controls. And by the way, these aren't static. None of these are static solutions. They're constantly evolving. And I think that's something we really need to emphasize.
Yeah, and I think I would go a step further and say your identity is the
Yes.
most important thing, and it's not.
Good point.
Yeah, it's not your social security number,
Right.
It's how are you represented
Well said.
online? How do people perceive you? How do you protect yourself from being spoofed?
Are they
by
teaching this to
whatever?
kids in high school at all?
I think we need to do more.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
we're not-
financial health and
And it's
literacy,
probably
right?
one of the areas that is yet to be innovated in, but has the most opportunity. If you go back to the early promises of blockchain, and like
Right.
if it was turned into a security protocol, rather than tracking NFT transactions, maybe
authenticity.
this is maybe there is a way that it can be built into the system, but until those abilities are used for good, right?
But I think that's a really important. It's a really important point because I think that ultimately, like who you are is now a physical and a digital space.
Yes.
And it's really challenging to protect your digital space. And if you know, one misstep, and next thing you know, right, somebody has a lot of your data and it is impersonating you. That's the concern that I have. And I think it's not just a young person concern. You know, it's for all of us. I think they just happen to probably be more active in that space.
And financial recoupment, right? You know, through some of the insurance that is offered, or you know, ways that still doesn't rid the headache, and
It doesn't, right? It's just some
and
cash,
and the
right?
ripple effect of of actually having identity stolen, and the long-term impact of those things on an individual, and then you kind of see how it permeates into an organization then, and it's the reason why there's no follow-up is because everyone wants to put their head in the sand.
Yeah.
And pretend it never happened.
You talk about insurance. I mean, that's a whole separate podcast, I think. But if you ever want to look at what are some of the most riskiest things out there, you see what the premium costs are for those things. And I can tell you, cyber insurance has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
I mean, it's again back to where we started. It's the number one threat facing. It's indiscriminate. It's everywhere. And it's reflected in your insurance premium. So another reason, take necessary steps, regardless of your size of business, to protect yourself, because you don't want those premium costs to go through the roof.
Yeah.
And there's protections for everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I think if people walk away from hearing this and at least know, like, hey, I'm a 3-person, LLC, or I'm a large company, like, you can protect your business, you can protect your assets, your data. The approach might be a little bit different, but it doesn't have to cost you a fortune. There might be regulatory things that make it a little bit more difficult. But, your basic protections, you can do those.
Flood insurance. God's sake,
Flood
you
insurance?
live by a river.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no one's thinking about that with
Well,
cyber.
it has
Yeah.
to
Good
become
point, Sam.
part of
Right.
that,
Yeah.
birds and bees-esque
Yeah.
kind of conversation,
Yeah.
like in a household where, I mean, I remember like when I first saw my Social Security card, and it was like, I think it was like, don't ever lose this. It's
Yeah,
the
right.
one
Right,
you're
yeah.
ever gonna get. And like, yeah, and
This
it's
piece
like-
of paper.
I had it in my wallet. So I was like, what are you doing? Like, you don't know where that's gonna like. So, but there's that. It's instilled in you, and
Right.
there isn't that point of view right now with online engagement or interaction or presence, or really how we handle ourselves in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think, did we solve all the problems?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I feel like we did.
just made it
I feel
worse.
like we
Good. Yeah, right.
Getting the sign that we have 2 minutes. Thank you, Scott.
We gotta build this up.
So I mean,
Can I say just?
Oh, yeah,
just on a-
absolutely,
I
yeah,
think on a
yeah.
positive note. I mean, we're talking. This is a very real conversation, and it's good, and hopefully that brings value to whoever's viewing it. But there's a lot of positives, right? I think to end on a very positive note, I truly believe we're on the brink of a technology revolution. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence. There's obviously increased risk, and there's more that we have to do. And I think Jay said it so eloquently. Same with you, BJ. That digital ID and your fingerprint out there. Needs more value and training, but at the end of the day, the goal here is to improve the quality of life for everybody, right? And hopefully technology, I'm as one of our keynotes said, the humanism, right, has to stay there. We keep talking about we build the technology, so I think it's incumbent upon us make sure the humanism stays in there so that it will provide a benefit to everybody.
until it becomes self-aware, and that's a whole different.
Yeah, and then
problem.
right, yeah, exactly.
And then we can join this podcast.
Yeah.
And talk about it.
But so to kind of wrap, is there in interest of what we hope to accomplish through these events, is there something that either of you have thought through or have previously or through some of the conversation today that is worth just trying, or a pilot or something that, let's test this, let's try this, let's implement this, whether it's individually or, as a broad policy, something, or created or something done that would be incremental to creating a better environment?
So I think I've got a couple answers, but I'll say I would like to see more information sharing. So one thing that I felt was really positive when I was in higher ed was, they all shared information pretty well. The sense of competition wasn't quite the same. Stepping back and now being sort of in more of the private sector space, there's industry-based sharing, but it doesn't bubble up to everybody. And I think, as I'll call us as the good guys, I think the more widely we can get information out, it helps people move and react more quickly to things. And I'd rather see that less compartmentalized. And I don't really know, that's like the Ren ISAC, which is a higher ed ISAC, or the MS ISAC, which is a state-funded one. Like, the threats are pretty much the same. I think the risk there, like the reading the data, just isn't that high. I don't want to totally dismiss it. I think we need to share information better, because it kind of is, the good guys in the security space against the threat actors. Let's all share that information and work better together.
I agree. I would just add, keep it simple.
Yeah.
Start simple at least, and keep it simple. Build some capacity, get some momentum going with your employees if you're a business owner, and then just continue to build off of that. And
Yeah.
before you know it, you're going to have a strong security system that hopefully will thwart attacks.
Great, gentlemen. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll be back in a few with AI folks.
Thanks, it was a
you.
pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Welcome back. So this is the second follow-up podcast here. We're talking about continuing the AI conversation. With us is Dr. Kristen Lucera from Rebellion Group, Chief AI and Data Scientist. State Senator James Maroney, thank you for joining us, and co-founder and Chief Revenue Officer of Crush Bank, Brian Mullaney. Pleasure to have you guys.
Nice to be here.
Kind of coming out of the panel and the conversation, we were just talking quickly about the protocols or the usage and the protections of enterprise organizations or corporate businesses and AI. The cybersecurity conversation sort of led into that, where you talk about the infrastructure in place in many ways, or the leadership in place at many of those organizations are a bit legacy or a bit behind. So the fear that you were referencing of use or acceptance and integration of AI into practices may have roots in that their infrastructure just isn't ready to effectively accept it.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think there's, well, just as with anything else, if you don't understand it, there's always apprehension around it, right? And there's fear that, I think that there's a general fear of sort of litigation, or, they'll end up in an issue. But, you could speak to that. I think that if there is some legislation in place, it gives a framework for these companies to kind of, possibly feel safer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something I've heard. My brother pointed this out to me. He's like, when the last company he worked at, they wanted to know, what are our red lines on either side? And we're going to innovate. We're going to take as many risks as possible within that box, right? And so we want to make sure that we're giving a clear roadmap to people on how to comply. And the other thing is not leaving it to the courts to decide. You mentioned litigation. Illinois, 2008, they passed their Biometric Information Protection Act. It was really the only major privacy law that allowed for a private right of action. There were lawsuits until 2019. There was one decision that came down that kind of determined what you could sue for harm, and since then lawsuits have increased by 1,400%, but they just settled the first one in 15 years. So do we want businesses tied up in courts for the next 10 years, whereas we can say, these are the things that you can do, these are the things that you can't, and if you do these things, they mentioned the cybersecurity safe harbor early on, right? It's the same provision we're taking. If you're doing the right things, we don't want to penalize you. And I think, to the businesses, Boston Consulting Group did a study January of 2024. 62% of their businesses said they were holding off on fully investing until there were clear-cut regulations on what you can and can't do. And again, technology changes. I think Mary in the panel said it. It's not the technology, it's the use case, right? We want to look at a risk-based approach, and a lot of these things are not new, especially in finance, right? I mean, you guys have been using.
Well, we have a complete misnomer of a name. So the bank, we actually, when we incorporated in Delaware, we had to get the SEC to say that we're not a bank because we don't hold anybody's money.
Right.
It's a bank of information.
Okay.
But the point sort of I think this is interesting because this is the first technology, and whatever, as long as I've been around, 35 years, that was consumer grade first, right? Like, so if you think about, like 25 years ago, the internet comes out from a functional standpoint, and Cisco was already a $100 million company at the time, and people were buying stuff off the shelf. Right. So it was a trusted experience that people rolled into from a commercial grade, and you sort of followed the money and the value from that perspective. Here, two and a half years ago, this technology, this magic bean gets dropped on everyone's lap, and they say, go to town. So no one knows what they're doing, frankly. And so there was a comment earlier today, and by no one, I mean like the broad cross-section of the public. So like when Lockheed talks about what they're doing and how they're guardrailing it, that doesn't worry me, or how they run, airplanes or whatever, fighter pilot. Like, I'm sure they have their proverbial act together, fairly bulletproof. It's the other 99 companies that don't have the wherewithal, skill sets, or otherwise to even know like what's in an open AI model, right? Like nobody even knows the inputs, never mind the outputs. So you start talking about securing data versus, I'm going somewhere with this, by the way, but like you start securing data versus like just the input. You don't understand both ends of the equation. So this is where, as small businesses, you do need guidance. I do like the idea of it's all about the outputs, and locally, I think I'm not a government official in any way whatsoever, but like there's no excuse for anything that you build that breaks a law, right? Like if you make those things very clear, I think that's important. But my final thing is like the education is the real problem here, and there's just not an understanding. Like small businesses and mid-sized businesses wait because one side is regulation and one side is lack of understanding. And it's kind of funny, the ones that plow into it really have less of a clue as to what's happening as opposed to those that wait to say, all right, well, the large language model I'm using needs to be transparent, needs to be manageable, needs to be controlled, needs to be governed. What does govern mean? So you can go on for a while, but like these are the things that need to be understood, and it's great from a velocity perspective, but it's challenging from an output control and trustworthiness perspective because everyone jumped into this to this consumer grade function so quickly.
But to your point, with a little bit of a lack of understanding of
Totally.
of what it actually can do, what it has access to, and what use of it provides it, right? And that feels like that crossover as well when we talk about security. It seems like there are use guidelines, right, to how you would monetize or commercialize data that you require through a large language model, or make it active through a large language model or AI. But then it's about what am I exposing myself to by inviting these platforms or these systems into my organization, and having people that don't have the expertise, the procedures, the flight checklist, right? That are just grabbing corporate documents, putting them, in ChatGPT and saying, summarize this for me or whatever. Like, it's that the ramifications of the exposure that it opens up that seems to be still elusive, right? On like, where do you govern it? Where do you train it? But then you can't necessarily kind of mandate the training to the same way that you could fine a company for tracking through cookies, right?
I would add that it's the only industry or technology that I've experienced where it doesn't fail hard. Meaning, like software that you built 5-10 years ago, if it errors out, it's an error and it shuts down, right? Hallucination is not an error; it's a failure, but you don't know. And so if you don't understand what validation is, people don't under. There was a great Axios quote yesterday. It said, the background doesn't really matter, but the general point was, if you ask a model a question, it's trained to give you an answer,
regardless of whether
It has nothing to do with whether it's accurate or not, right? So, so that whole, we're just not used to that, frankly, needing to do that vetting. Probably should be for a whole number of reasons, but that's a different conversation. But like that, so that's created this. I can use it. I don't know if it's wrong. I don't know how to control the outputs.
Sometimes it's impossible to vet too. Like even if you're trying to, I used it for wayfinding and some preliminary research to in some areas, and it came back and told me, according to the survey, 32% of respondents, and luckily, it's an active client. We know that there was no such survey, right?
Right.
So it was like something's not matching up here.
and if you ask it, it will say, "No, I made that up."
Yeah.
Right.
That's the good best part,
Amazing,
right?
right? Yeah. Are you sure of that? No, I'm not.
No, I think you're right. The way that it's constructed is designed. I think part of it is like that we've come from the internet. And if you make a search on the internet, not that we believe everything on the internet, but if it came back and told you like hardened truth, here it is, I think that's how we're looking at it through that lens, right?
Fully agree.
And therefore it's thrown us off.
Right.
Because you're like, oh no, here it is. There was a study done.
Well, that gets back to the input, right? Like no one knows, or for that matter, cares what's in the model. The technology is just so amazing at one level.
The
So you ask,
transformers are not even interpretable half the time, right? Yeah.
right. So you're sitting there, write me a sonnet about, the New York Yankees, whatever. It's like, that's amazing and that's really cool. Now, give me a factual, numerical output. Like ChatGPT doesn't do math just as a benchmark, right? Like ask it how many R's there are in strawberry, and that's the kind of running joke, and it will argue with you. But like when you're looking for facts, you don't ask an LLM facts.
Correct.
You ask it to interpret information and create outputs, right? So the challenge is all of a sudden businesses are going and asking, like, you don't know what the input is with your own controlled data, you don't know what the output you know what the data set is in the input, and you're trusting it blindly.
Yeah,
And that gets back to my fear as opposed to not fear, but my focus as opposed to Lockheed.
Yeah, I was trying to explain this, exactly what you're saying to somebody, and I was like, trying to explain where the strength is in this sort of like, it's in the ability to take disparate information and potentially understand some sort of crossover. And I was like, if you ask it where to go to get gas, it's not going to really be. I think it told me, it was like a state over and it was already closed. It couldn't do that. But if I asked it, okay, I'm a witch and I'm flying around Fairfield County, I need a new broom. It did a pretty good job. There was like an Ace Hardware.
Yeah.
But that was an interesting use case. It was a crossover of a bunch of different things.
Right.
And it was providing, some semblance of an answer that, okay, it was completely fictitious. But the point is that the strength is in, one, you need to know how to use it.
Yeah.
And two, the more you can give it, the better the answer is potentially going to be. If it's just wide open, you're not really giving it the context, you're not giving it sort of like, anyway, sort of going off. But I think it's really, like you said, it's use case, but it's also teaching people on educating, like you said,
Yeah,
what it can and can't do.
And back to, the education point, I think right now the most important skills we can teach people are responsible use, right? Understanding it, it's not always accurate. That's my concern. You're going to get to a point where it's like a calculator. I plug in numbers, I just accept that answer. We don't want people going and just accepting, understanding you need to question, right, and look at that. Responsible use, lifelong learning, right, and knowing that you're going to need to continually update. And, on the prompt engineering, right, and learning how to ask the questions, I think Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, I don't know if you've read that. That's a great book. I know a lot of the superintendents are using that as kind of a basis. They've gotten together, how we do classes for students, and they had a discussion. I sat in on some of it, a discussion based around that book. But yeah, education, building the skills in, and what do they say, that English is now the new coding language, like learning how to ask the good questions. So,
But that's a good point. I was trying to make that point during the panel, is that if you do know how to code, then and you think like in that model, you can actually start to get it to do really interesting things.
Yeah.
But you really have to kind of like confine what you're asking and give it almost like a process.
Well, yeah, or it's going to hallucinate, right? Or it's going to but that's where, to the earlier point of just immediate to public and mass use, unless there becomes a bifurcation of, I understand that they need mass usage in order to continuously train, but that also then can't be a source of truth, right? So every other software there's a beta program, right? And you have users, and it's tested, and it's quality assured in some way, form or fashion. So it feels like some direction where there is an open door model, right? That doesn't then go and train it in the wrong direction feels like a potential future, sort of need or requirement or part of the regulation.
Many of them exist, right? Like if you go to Hugging Face, just
I'm there every day.
right. So that's like, they're transparent, they're open. You can tune them. You can do things that are energy-wise way less expensive with a couple billion parameter model versus multi-trillion. Like you're just wasting time chewing in energy. So there's all sorts of ways to be more effective and efficient and more specific. By the way, we're super pro, and that's our whole business. So I don't want to sound like we're like anti artificial intelligence or effectiveness. But the way, like your point is really interesting. Like you're getting to the point where 25% of the internet, to use a silly term, is synthetic, right? Like it's been developed by AI. And so you get like what's real and what's not real. You can send hyperlinks that show me here's the source, but it's getting like even that isn't enough in some cases. I got to go back and figure out what that really means. So like understanding what the training is.
And then compound on that the fact that 40% of the internet prior to that was based
baloney.
off of just people acting as if they want to be perceived, right? So
Right.
it's like,
Yeah.
what
So you
is-
have all
what is
sorts of
real?
trust or value, which is why like what's the data set? I think totally unprofessional opinion on this. Like I think you will see the bifurcation will be between like a real continued consumer grade, fun, quick effectiveness, things like that, and then real purpose built. Like, and it's not like this model, but it's like more this architecture, right? Like we're going to pull down the LLM. There's a governance framework to ensure that drift and bias and things like that, and those are real, not just like slapstick commentary to it. And then the inputs, and all three of those play. Because if I'm going to ask explicit questions around analytics for running my business, the data in and the data out need to be known, and the process, and that's here. It's just a matter of people understanding the difference.
And public use, super, sort of juvenile comparison, but early on, my first thought went to Wikipedia, and it was a user-generated encyclopedia that really wasn't regulated, and when you tried to cite it in for a book report or whatever, like you got laughed out of the room, right? And then eventually regulations, it needs to be it's policed, it's monitored, it's fact checked, and at some point the inputs need to have a filter for accuracy.
I think
even for these models.
it'll happen in a micro way, right? Like that's part of the. You brought up a good point that this was direct to consumer, and I never really thought of it that way. But they did that for obvious reasons, so that it would self-learn. But going the other way, it's going to have to be in small brains, right? In very finite areas.
Small language model.
Controlled
They
data
are the
sets,
future.
specific
Yep.
data sets, right? If you want answers, and it's amazing in our world, we have people routinely saying to us, like, I want it to be like ChatGPT. And like, respectfully, you don't even know what you're saying. ChatGPT doesn't do that, right? Like, you're asking for these analytical things that it can't do. So like that's the whole broad misunderstanding of what it can do in its current format versus like controlled, specific around the data, and then training and tuning that prompt engineering, prompt tuning and such to make it really functional.
Back to your Wikipedia analogy, right? Who would have thought when you started with Encarta, funded by Microsoft to be an online encyclopedia, and Wikipedia, that the less funded open source model would be the dominant one?
Right.
But open source is the future, right? As you're saying, it's the small language models because of the data privacy, because of the power consumption. So Hugging Face, right? Just like GitHub enabled so much of the software development, Hugging Face and others with the open source. That's where we're going to see a lot of the innovation. All the innovation and the use is going to come there. And it's, the accuracy, things become accurate when you use more than multiple models, right? And so you can have one model checking the other model. And I was talking with a company that built this, it's a pilot program for another state, helping them with things related to Medicaid, and it was like 60% accurate with one model. They're using 4 models, it's up to 97% accurate in handwriting analysis and transcribing. And so, but yeah, that future, I think, is that open source and being more localized, right, as you mentioned, because garbage in, garbage out, if we don't know the data that's going in, but they've shown with tightly curated data sets, right, for a specific purpose, it can be much more accurate.
What is your company? What do you guys specifically do? I'm just not aware of it.
So we have built an AI. It's based on IBM for whatever that's worth, but off of Watson X's frameworks, which allows for Hugging Face. There's a couple IBM LLMs that we use. But we also use Llama. We use Bedrock. We use a couple others. So to your point, like there's 3 or 4 different LLMs. But what we do is build a data lake that is based on corporate data. So it's a private data lake, so you can bring in ServiceNow or whatever, like things along those lines, that has documentation, repositories, Dropbox, SharePoint, the like, and then systems of record information from ticketing systems or whatever, and bring that in so that you can query it and build analytics and automations and things along those lines. Initially and primarily, we work with IT service providers or service providers where you have hundreds of thousands of inputted requests, and like, how do I create trends? How do I get information from multiple systems? How do I create automations for for inputs and the like. So we have very specific uses. Like we'll summarize an incoming ticket when you have a complaint, and we'll write a resolution based on all the notes, and we'll use one LLM for that because it's really good for that. We'll use another LLM to automate the ticket to say this is a remote access failure issue, right? Like that, boom, 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 and that kicks off a workflow, and that's a different LLM. So all these things sort of are very purpose-driven based on the data themselves. But it all comes down to the data set, right? Like lousy, no data, no good, and no understanding as to what the training is on the model, no good either. And the last comment on that is like we try to be as efficient as possible with each LLM, which I think is more than us, just an interesting thing. Steve, I believe, noted cost. Not a revolutionary comment, but I think a lot of people overlook the implications. Like, yeah, it's expensive and you want to buy 3 Mile Island and all that sort of stuff is a fun story. But the real thing is, how do I drive my cost per inference down so that when I run either a piece of software or I do it internally, no one understands it yet because they're not broadly consuming it. Like it's in the tens to hundreds of dollars a month. You're like, you roll that out broadly across hundreds or thousands of users, all of a sudden you've got a real line item on your P&L where you haven't controlled costs because you didn't think about how efficient you could be with an LLM. So a little more of a mouthful than I probably should have given you. But hopefully I tie it into why it all matters. So
Yeah, no.
You're activating all the data that was acquired through digital transformation that no companies figured out how to actually
I wouldn't give us that much credit, but yes.
So if it becomes a bit more structured on sort of the front end, it feels like that would limit some of the concern with how it could be misused, right? Kind of on the back end, but not entirely, right? We still can't police everyone, right, based off of having accurate data.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
One of the interesting things that we do with IBM is they indemnify their models.
Right.
And then they will indemnify models that they sign off on that aren't even theirs, which is a pretty cool thing for a business downstream to be able to build into their process, right? Like bias for sure and all sorts of other things that because they're monitoring them so tightly and they are so transparent with them. Now, they won't indemnify all of them, but the idea of indemnifying the model, I think, is a real value for, again, the tiny business or the cutting edge adopter might not be thinking about it. But we work with a lot of companies that are like, I'm not doing it yet because of what you said, James, right? And like, but if I can say I can indemnify it, that crosses, or we can, like that
Gives
that'll,
certainty.
right? Yeah, that
gives
eliminates
us
some
more
risk,
certainty.
right? Yeah. So.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because we're talking about valid use cases for business, and then the potential, let's say, overreach of their application to take advantage of personal information or additional data. But then the headlines also go to the criminal uses or inappropriate uses, revenge porn or whatever it may be.
98% of deepfake video is porn, right? And it's non-consensual intimate images. I think last year, well, in 2023, I'm not sure, in 2024, 12 children in the United States died because they were victims of sextortion. And I think they were talking about, the ability to go catch someone. And actually the FBI, there's a boy in Michigan who died by suicide who was tricked into sending a naked image of himself.
I saw.
And then they caught it. It was men in Nigeria who had, and then they blackmailed him, Now, my concern is what happens when you don't even need to send that picture, right? You can get blackmailed. We know in New Jersey, we've seen the non-consensual intimate images with high school girls that took the yearbook photo and generated naked images of them. Everyone heard about it when it happened to Taylor Swift, but it's happening in Connecticut, right? And disproportionately, the victims are women. Over, I think, 90% of the non-consensual intimate images are created, for women. So, right, we know that there are criminal uses that we need to protect. We also know, again, looking at use cases, right? It's harder to detect like the audio, right? And it's going to go in waves, right? The detection. Yeah. I think at one point they were 94% accurate, but as they get more accurate in detecting, you get more, and so you're going to wave. So it's going to be between never 100%, but over 90% accurate. But, we mentioned like the fear for the elderly. What if they're taking their grandchild's voice to call and say, send me money here, or this has happened? There's so many things, potential harms that, actually not even potential, harms that we know about. It's hard to, criminalize all of those. I think that's what we all agree, right, in those areas, and we will create penalties. But it's looking at, a lot of what we're talking about is more the generative, the newer, right, in the last couple of years, versus the automated decision-making, which instances of harm go back over a decade, right, or longer in that. And that's what I'm concerned with, is like 80 to 88% of companies are now using AI to screen resumes,
Yeah.
right?
I was
And
mentioning
so
Yeah.
what happens you brought up when you were talking, like the data, right? The data in, the garbage in, garbage out. If we're not looking at the data, if you're making it biased, right, based on biased information that's going in. And so there was, the most well-known is the 2014 Amazon hiring algorithm that wanted to hire
Amazing.
technologists, right?
Just
And it,
crossed off all the women,
yep.
Yes,
And
that's the thing. Like we hit
right?
these inherent biases that we hold.
Right.
It's not worth that discussion. But if that's your training data set, and that's not an easy thing to weed out either.
Right.
No, well, there's a medical example you probably know,
Yes.
where
Princeton?
I think it was the Princeton, was where the tumors were all the ones that had
no, this is-
the little measurement, whatever you call it, the little slide ruler on it.
Yes.
So, I mean, that was the takeaway from the training, was that all the malignant tumors happen to have
Have
these
it.
little slide rules next to it showing the
Yes.
size of it.
Because that's how it learned.
That's what it learned. It said, oh, if it has this, then it's malignant. So, like, if you don't understand what you're doing to train the model, then that's how you end up with these absurd use case or these absurd problems, right?
Yeah.
So, and if there's no transparency in the model, then you can't tune it, you can't adjust it.
And I think that's an excellent point, transparency, because everyone says, well, it's already illegal to discriminate. How do you know? Right? If it's a
Trying to
black
make
box
that point.
nature
Right.
of an algorithm,
It's
because there was-
systemic. It becomes actually systemic or systematic.
Right.
It's systematically inherent in it, but you don't know, and that's.
so we're at risk of encoding
Yes.
systemic racism.
I don't think people are.
Basically, like it's
Yeah.
encoding what's the
Yes.
world now and perpetuating that forward.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also bias that's harmful that's not necessarily criminal, right? And so the definition of disparate impact is the
Mm-hmm.
4/5 rule. So, and for instance, there was an example where they were using an algorithm to determine mortgages. And if you were white and had a 640 credit score, you had a 95% chance of being approved. But if you were black, everything else is the same, 640 credit score, you had an 80% chance of being approved. Everyone here, we would say, wow, that's horrible. That's not criminal. Because 80% of 95% would be, as long as it was above a 76%, it doesn't meet the threshold. And so, but that's still harmful.
That's the 4/5 rule.
Yeah. And then they went back and they corrected and they changed the instructions and said, avoid discrimination, and you're approved at equal rates. So that's also the issue is the good thing about discrimination in an algorithm is we can test for it and we can fix it, right? And that's why what gets measured improves, right? And so I think that regulation should just be based on my perspective is on impact assessments. Just like in almost any other consumer safety where we're discussing airplanes, discussing the Waymo vehicles, right? You test relative to the risk. An airplane's riskier, so it needs a more stringent testing than a car, but that needs way more stringent testing than a bicycle, right? And so if you're making an important decision about someone's life, I think we need to know it's fair and accurate. And that's where I rely.
Yeah, well, to be able to pull the thread back and see where it came from, right, is
Right.
step one. There is a governance effort. I think that term is being thrown around way too slap happy. And I see it, people are like, yeah, it's got governance, and I feel like it's like a Blazing Saddles comment. Like, they're like, it's just total throwaway.
Yeah.
Like, there's like real understanding of what that means when you talk about drift. Like, what does drift mean, right? And like, that is a feature, not a bug in terms of these models. And if you're looking for output that's consistent, you're not using it right, unless you're guarding against it and you've got that all built in. So it's not about what products do it. It's about the fact that you really need that bias to be measured and governed, the drift to be governed, and you need a process to do that routinely. None of this is like anti-AI in my perspective at all. I think it will help it push out faster and more
No, it's just
effectively
understanding
when
the
people
reality.
understand
Like,
it. Yeah.
I mean, because you have 30 years of drift, like since
For sure.
October '94 when the first ad and every campaign that's followed, the quintillion,
Yeah.
ads that have been optimized for different purposes that are informing data that we are now acting off of. It's systemic, so it has to sort of be reevaluated. I know we're coming up on time. As a sort of a takeaway to you gentlemen, what we're trying to do is have something positive, some direction that comes from these conferences, from these events. Is there anything that maybe it was on your mind prior to, but came up in conversation today, that a little test, a pilot, something that would help kind of advance this discussion in a positive way, or create some change that has felt like needs to happen?
Well, I think that at least in this industry, I think that the idea of these sort of the future forward is like it's these micro sort of like brains. I think they even call them. There's also RAGs. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially RAG is what we're talking about
Yep.
in terms of like controlled in and controlled out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's a
retrieval, right? Like there's no
promise.
retrieval if you don't have a data set from which to retrieve, right? So
And I think that, I mean, as you brought up, and as we were talking about, I think that is where the future is. But at least it's being acknowledged and discussed.
yeah.
And even if the general public doesn't recognize that, the hope is that, I mean, these big generative models, they want to be accurate.
Right.
So there seems like there's possibly a path there.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway is that I'm an optimist for the future with AI. I think everyone here, we're optimistic about the positive impact it can have. We're not, I think saying that you want guardrails is not out of fear. It's more so we can yield the true upside. I think we didn't touch in here on the workforce. I think that's a critical piece. I think personally we have the next 3 years to be intentional and thoughtful with our workforce development and training outreach before we're permanently leaving a segment of our population behind. And I think that's the key. And finally, I just want to thank you guys for having these conversations, because the other thing that's critical to the future, incorporating multiple voices, but getting businesses, government, and academia talking together through these problems.
Absolutely. I mean, outside of getting everyone in the same room and letting them fight it out, that's the only
Yeah.
thing we can do. But so thank you for joining us. Thanks to our newfound viewers on streaming, and we'll see you through the next event.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you
Great.
for having
Really
us.
appreciate it.
Yeah.